Modern Russian history is centered around one major event, the Soviet Union, particularly its controversial collapse. Historians have debated the causes that led to the fall of the Soviet Union for years and have yet to arrive at a consensus. American historians have been the most vocal about this topic, putting forth their own Western-centric explanations, but a few brave Russians have responded. I use the word brave because uncovering the causes of the collapse of the Soviet Union involves talking about subjects that Russian leadership has not yet been able to accept. Since 2003, 10 high-profile political critics have been murdered in or around Russia for vocalizing dissent. These numbers include the deaths of Paul Klebnikov, an American, and Anna Politkovskaya, a Russian, who both authored books about the end of the Soviet Union. In the book In Defense of History, Richard J. Evans declares that historical writing serves more to gain insight about the time in which it was written rather than the subject of the work itself. This statement rings true, especially when thinking about the limited number of Russian historians writing about the end of the Soviet Union and what their current occupations are. Vladislav Zubok, author of A Failed Empire, the Soviet Union, written in 2009, is a professor at the London School of Economics, although he was born and educated in Moscow. Similarly, Russian historian Serhiy Plokhy, who was born in Novgorod and educated in Moscow and Kiev, has recently released The Last Empire in late 2014 and is currently a professor at Harvard University. In spite of their secure whereabouts, their books are a defensive response against Western accounts and offer their own interpretation. Plokhy in particular puts forth a scenario similar to that in E. H. Carr's What is History?, in which there are many possible causes to an event, but some are more influential than others. In this case, he argues that the fall was not the handiwork of the United States, but rather had more to do with Yeltsin's behavior during and after the August coup. Zubok also argues that Western accounts have greatly exaggerated the pragmatism and aggressiveness of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. These Russian accounts have come to us only in recent years, but American historians have actually been publishing books about the fall of the Soviet Union as early as 1993, less than 2 years after its official end. Of these 3 books I have focused on for this project, 2 were written in the year 1993 and the other in 2001. Like their Russian peers, these 3 American authors are currently in coveted positions at elite institutions. The difference is that they were born in the U.S. and received a Western education. Ronald Suney's 1993 book, The Revenge of the Past, Nationalism, Revolution, and the Collapse of the Soviet Union, is a good example of possibly exaggerated depictions of the late Russian leadership's authority. As Plokhy notes, different historians attribute different causes to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Stephen Kotkin, David Remnick, and Ronald Suney all have distinct arguments concerning Gorbachev's administration, the deep flaws of the regime from the very beginning, and the nationalism of the surrounding republics, respectively. Of the 3, only Kotkin goes out of his way to show that he does not subscribe to the view that the U.S. was much involved, but his book Armageddon Averted was written with 10 years of retrospect. Furthermore, of the 3 American authors, only one draws on first-hand experience in the Soviet Union. David Remnick, who is now editor-in-chief of The New Yorker, often references his time as the Moscow correspondent to the Washington Post in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book Lenin's Tomb, The Last Days of the Soviet Empire. Even so, there is a clear difference between the attitudes of Russian nationals toward Russia and their American counterparts. In the book Historiography, George G. Eggers emphasizes the effect that nationality has in academia. This effect is clear when looking at American and Russian accounts of the fall of the Soviet Union. From the very moment that the Soviet Union collapsed, Americans had the freedom and opportunity to analyze and write about it in a critical way. Meanwhile, Russians who were experiencing the turmoil of the early 90s were, and still are, less disposed to analyze and talk about the subject. Even in the books by the Russian historians, there remains a sense of respect for Russia that is prevalent throughout their work. Despite differences in style and perspective, all the authors make strong use of primary sources. Although that seems in line with Rankean beliefs, he would have probably stirred in his grave to find out that many of these primary sources were oral interviews with Russian people. Of course, it is actually the American historians that make more use of this, because they did not have the first-hand lived experience that the Russian historians did. The escalating situation in Russia in the decades following 1991 has already given birth to many new published works and updated editions of older ones, including some of the books mentioned here. Unfortunately, it is unlikely that we will see many analyses of it from a Russian perspective. As tensions continue rising, historians have begun to question their own accounts of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and no one is sure of what will happen next.